Welcome to our review of the absolute monarchies. This map shows Europe in 1500. Nations are pretty well established, and one thing they share in common is being ruled by a monarch or a king. By the late 1500s, the Protestant Reformation was well enough underway that most of these kingdoms were readily identified with either being Roman Catholic or Protestant, Eastern Orthodox Christian, or Muslim. One thing all that these rulers had in common is their desire to rule as an absolute monarch. An absolute monarch, very simply, rules with absolute power. It is a king or queen who holds all the power within their borders. And in order to gain and maintain this rule, monarchs work to centralize that power, to bring it to the center towards them. And in doing so, taking power away from the nobles and gathering all the power to themselves. Most of these monarchs believed that the rationale or the reasoning for their having all the power stemmed from what they called the divine right of monarchies. In other words, they believed that God had placed them on the throne, that if God didn't want them to be ruler, they wouldn't be the ruler. So the subjects of the kingdom should follow everything that the king said. All the power belonged to the king. The two absolute monarchs we're most interested in are Louis XIV of France and Peter the Great of Russia. This is a modern map of France, but it shows France as a very large country that is rich in natural resources and in agricultural lands. Our look at the absolute monarchy in France begins with Henry IV. Henry, or the fourth French king named Henry, was the first in the new line of royal house, the Bourbons. In other words, the family whose last name was Bourbon. Henry IV was raised as a Huguenot. You might remember those are French followers of Calvin, and living in Roman Catholic dominant France, suffered persecution through the years. As Henry had the opportunity to become the next king of France, he converts to Catholicism in order to be a ruler of more of a united France. One of Henry's big accomplishments comes from his background as a Huguenot. In a document known as the Edict of Nantes, or Announcement, he guarantees the freedom of worship and political rights to the Huguenots. This ends years of religious civil war within France between Catholics and Protestants. Henry IV was murdered in 1610, and his son Louis XIII becomes king at the age of 10. Now, they did not expect a 10-year-old to rule, and in his stead, a regent ruled in the king's name. In this case, Louis's mother ruled as the regent. When Louis becomes old enough, power transitions to him. Louis was a particularly weak ruler, but did well in choosing very strong advisors. Louis XIII was really not interested in the day-to-day running of his kingdom. He depended on the abilities of his top advisor, Cardinal Richelieu. Cardinal Richelieu was a cardinal or senior official within the Catholic Church, but he effectively ran France on a daily basis. He worked diligently to strengthen the monarchy and to improve the absolute component of the king's rule. In doing so, he takes power from the nobles. He undoes some of Henry's work and takes some political power from the Huguenots, and strengthens the authority of the intendants, who are the king's representatives in the rural provinces. During Louis XIII's reign, the 30 Years' War breaks out in what is today Germany. This war, which lasted 30 years, begins as a Protestant rebellion against the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor. It quickly devolves into a war about many more things, including power and money and land. Cardinal Richelieu of France sees this as a great opportunity to make France stronger by encouraging the other countries to get involved in the war. And as they fought each other, it simply made them weaker. The 30 Years' War was a particularly nasty war. In this table or this map here, we can see that the impacts were devastating to the groups that were involved in the fighting. Famine, disease, as well as killings through the war meant that in some parts of what is today Germany, more than 50% of the population died during that 30-year war. The countryside and the cities and towns and villages were devastated, and the cost of the war was tremendous and led basically to the bankruptcy of many of these countries. Louis XIV of France, in many ways, is the prime example of an absolute monarch. He comes to power at the age of 3 or 4 and rules for the next 72 years. In those 72 years, he works diligently to make his power absolute. One of the best known examples of Louis XIV's absolute rule was the Palace of Versailles. Louis had the palace built in the village of Versailles, which is about 20 miles outside of Paris. And he wanted the palace to represent the grandeur and the power both of himself and of France overall. It is an amazing place. The cost was so high that it actually staggered the French economy, and it took years, if not centuries, for France to fully recover. Louis XIV is also known as the Sun King because he adopts the sun as his personal symbol. In these pictures, we see a dancer dressed as the sun and a small emblem of the Palace of Versailles featuring Louis's sun. Louis liked to say that just as the sun's rays reached far and wide, so did his power. Louis XIV was certainly a believer in the divine right of kings. We can see that in this painting that he had commissioned that shows an angel placing the crown on his head, implying God's approval and God's desire that Louis be the absolute monarch of France. The French court at Versailles soon became the ideal for European monarchs. The high fashion, lavish entertainment soon became the standard that other monarchs tried to imitate, but they never quite were able to equal it. Next, we'll look at Russia, a monarchy where the land is much different and life is much different than in France, but also had an absolute monarch. Russia, because of its location, was geographically isolated from the rest of Europe. Only its westernmost point was in contact with Europe. Russia is almost entirely landlocked, which means it doesn't have access to the sea. While yes, there is access to the sea up here, the weather means that for a great deal of the year, this land or this water is frozen and cannot be accessed by wooden ships of the time. Russia is also culturally isolated from Europe because most of its contact with the outside world does not go through Europe, it actually goes through Constantinople. And there are many things about Russian life that were significantly different from the life in Europe. One significant cultural difference between Russia and Europe was Russia were followers of the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church, which you may remember had split from the Roman Catholic Church in the first millennium. Another example of cultural isolation, or how Russia differed from Europe, was in alphabet. The Russians used the Cyrillic alphabet rather than the Roman alphabet that the Europeans did. The Russian monarch that we are interested in is Peter I, also known as Peter the Great. He's a member of the House of Romanov. Peter the Great had three main goals during his monarchy. He wished to end the landlocked problem by gaining access to a warm water port that would allow Russia to trade and communicate freely and easily with Europe. Peter also recognized that Russia was significantly behind Europe in terms of technology, learning, and education. He wished to westernize Russia. And finally, like all the absolute monarchs, Peter the Great looked to centralize power, to take power from the nobles and to centralize it all within the role of the monarch. Peter addresses the landlocked problem by going to war with Sweden and gaining access to the Baltic Sea. Here he builds St. Petersburg from scratch and makes it the new capital, moving the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg, which would make it much easier to travel from Europe to the Russian capital. Although he's never fully successful in completely westernizing Russia, Peter the Great does make significant progress. At one point, he had traveled secretly to Europe to learn the latest in scientific and military knowledge and technology. This painting actually shows him when he was traveling in disguise, disguised as a carpenter, working in a Dutch shipyard where he hoped to learn the secrets of shipbuilding. As King of Russia, he brings Western artisans and technicians back to Russia to do much of the work, particularly in building St. Petersburg. He transforms his army to a more modern Western-style army and navy, and he brings Western European, particularly French, manners to the royal court. At the royal court of Russia, you now spoke French rather than Russian. And in an attempt to solidify that change to Western thought, Peter the Great makes nobles wear European-style clothing and speak French rather than English. These paintings illustrate some of Peter's attempts to westernize Russia. On the far right is a painting of a Russian nobleman in the traditional nobleman attire. The fur coat, and notice the long beard. Peter's attempts to westernize, to force the nobleman to wear European-style clothing, is shown in this portrait of Peter himself in the center. Notice he is clean-shaven and wearing a Western-style military uniform. Of note, in an attempt to force the nobles to change, Peter instituted a beard tax, which meant that you could keep your beard, but you had to pay a high tax every year for that privilege. And finally, the painting on the left shows Peter in the shipyard in Holland, where he is learning about shipbuilding. So the bottom line on Peter the Great as an absolute monarch: while he fails to westernize Russia completely, he does make significant progress. And he turns Russia from a backward country into a much more powerful, more modern nation. So to summarize the characteristics of absolute monarchs, they all shared the following. They were kings or queens who held all the power within their borders. They believed that they ruled by divine right, or that it was God's will that they were king or queen, and that all of their followers or citizens should do what the king or queen said. And in order to rule with absolute power and to gain absolute power, these monarchs worked to centralize the power within the king rather than spread out throughout the country in the hands of the noblemen. Thank you for joining us as we reviewed absolute monarchies.